and each presentation will include a slideshow, so you will see that on your screen. At the end of each presentation, I'll ask one question from the chat box, and then right at the end, there'll be open Q&A, and hopefully there'll also be time for each of the speakers to just kind of maybe give their final thoughts. So for now, allow me to please introduce our three speakers, and I'll be doing that in the order that they'll be presenting today. So the first is Daniela Genrich. Now, she is a long-standing social HIV and gender activist. She's coordinator of the We Will Speak Out Coalition of South Africa, and she's a lay canon in the Anglican Diocese of Natal, where she's leading on a new gender ministry. She has 3 master's degrees and has led on a number of publications. And at the same time, she has extensive experience in the NGO sector and as a consultant and life coach. So in all of these different worlds that she inhabits, she's motivated by the belief that the faith sector plays a huge role in ending gender-based violence in South Africa. Our second speaker is Selena Palm. She's a researcher here at the Unit for Religion and Development Research and a very dear colleague of mine. She has a focus on equipping faith actors around gender-based violence, violence against children, and exploring the social norms that often lie beneath these forms of violence. She holds a PhD in Theology and Development from UKZN and a Master's in Systematic Theology from Stellenbosch. And she has 18 years of experience as a practitioner working within faith communities in East and Southern Africa on HIV and AIDS. So if all of that wasn't enough, she's also a lay leader and preacher in her local congregation. And then last but definitely not the least is Miranda Pillay. Now, she's someone whose work I've been reading and following for years, so it's such an honor to have her here on this webinar. She is a retired senior lecturer at the University of Western Cape, but like all good teachers, she continues to teach there part-time in New Testament studies and ethics. She also remains a research fellow there. But UWC's loss of a full-time lecturer has meant the rest of the world's gain, because Miranda is now engaging with various organizations and institutions on gender justice issues. She describes herself as a theoethical feminist biblical scholar, and her perspectives on gender power relations, gender justice, and ethics has influenced and is continuing to influence academics, practitioners, students, and religious leaders across the globe. So it really is for all of us such an honor to have the three of you here. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Daniela. I'm going to mute myself and put my video off. Thank you, Daniela.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this invitation. I'm really excited to engage with all of you and as part of this panel. Before we start, I just wanted to mention, just to remind us that we may be talking quite a bit in theory today, but behind and inside all of those things that we talk about are families and survivors and children and people who are really, really struggling. It's really come into my personal experience as the lay canon for gender and gender-based violence in my diocese in the last few weeks, where we've had a priest's family, where his wife, who was a teacher, committed suicide, and he has just been murdered last night. And there are all kinds of stories floating around about violence and all kinds of things. And there are children and these kinds of tragedies. You know, we hear of some high-level cases, but the reality is that it's just ordinary people's lives. So I just thought to remind us as we proceed. I've been asked to speak about the gender dimensions of the pandemic, and particularly gender-based violence. So I just wanted to share that in KwaZulu-Natal and also more broadly, the SACC and KZNCC set up a joint churches initiative to address some of the consequences of COVID-19. And I was asked to assist them think through some of the gender dimensions of that. And I prepared a document which I presented to the steering committee. And I wanted to just list the 4 key areas that I had mentioned there, and to reflect on how those have actually played out in the light of each of the steps or stages in lockdown. So, yeah, please can you go to the next slide? I'm presuming it's coming. Oh, yes, okay. So it's just really 3 parts. So one is just looking at the background and some of the predictions I had made more generally, very briefly, and then to track some of those gendered impacts by lockdown levels, because it hasn't been the same depending on the levels of restrictions. And then the last, I'm really leaving more up to the other 2 speakers who've been asked to address those issues. Just to say very briefly, a lot of what I'm going to speak about comes from my own contact as an activist with community-based structures and organizations working on the ground, largely in KZN, but also in other provinces through various networks that I'm part of. So a lot of it is kind of anecdotal, and I'm not wanting to make any sweeping generalized statements, but this is the impression that I've had from the perspectives that I've been working from. So the first issue is, that's all we have to, we can just stay on that slide. I haven't got a slide for every point, because so much of what I want to talk about is more narrative. So I think the issue, the economic impacts have been huge. A lot of women survive as informal traders. The majority of informal traders are women. And as you know, under lockdown 5 and 4, it wasn't possible for them to function. And so their economic situation was direly affected, and we'll talk about that shortly. Also, the burden of everyday care and keeping and holding the family together, keeping the peace, ensuring the children are doing their online learning if that's what they've got access to, or keeping them busy and trying to keep everybody safe has been huge. And then, of course, as the curve has steepened, given that the burden of care is very often on women, that is still being played out, and some of the economic and personal impacts of that are yet to be seen. Thirdly, access to information. In our experience, the information campaigns of government really didn't reach far and wide. And a lot of women were completely unaware of some of the risks, and also some of the information that has been going around on social media around self-care and mental wellness and so on, they have not had access to. And lastly, the issue of domestic and intimate partner violence. All over the world, countries have reported increases in domestic violence in particular, but violence against women and children in general. And really, if you think about it, the confinement and the isolation, the disruption of social networks, the uncertainties, the fear, and all the stresses around economic insecurity and so on have really created a space for increasing emotional instability and the family fabric to be at risk. We'll talk more about that just now as well. So just to say, on gender-based violence statistics, people keep asking me, have the statistics got worse, and what can you say, and so on. What I can say is that we don't know. There have never really been clear, verifiable statistics of gender-based violence. We've heard a number of reports from the command center, which were then corrected, and then other reports now and then, but no clear overall picture is available. What I can say is that what I did access was Lifeline statistics in KwaZulu-Natal alone in the first 3 weeks of April after the beginning of lockdown. 2,303 cases were formally reported and addressed by SATs or TCCs, etc. So that I don't know if that gives a little bit of a picture. And just to remember that gender-based violence is not new under COVID-19, but the conditions are such that the possibility of things getting out of hand were really always there. And let's have a look at the different stages, the different levels, and see how they have been played out. Just checking on my time. So in level 5 was really the era of silence. Very little information got out, although it's interesting that in KZN alone there were those cases. Hunger was reported a lot already, quite quickly, and men preying on women as a result of their desperation and the need for food for their children, and offering food in exchange for sex was reported, particularly in Durban Centre. Also, some women were mugged on their way to shops. There were men that were lying in wait if they knew that they were on their own. Many couples, just in terms of relationships, many couples have not ever stayed together in households for long, with church groups to go to and shebeens to go to at night and so on. And so the pressure and the kind of pressure cooker in terms of those relationships has, I think, been quite extreme. And then reporting under cramped conditions with fear of abusers and so on was very, very difficult. And we had some reports of, there was one or two who ran away to the police station, managed to get away, but on her way she was stopped by security forces. And she was too scared to say what the issue was, and she was flog marched back home, straight back to the abuser, and told she must go and get a protection order the next day. And other situations where there have been very heavy-handed responses. So there's been a reluctance to report. Church leaders and members without access to internet have been quite frustrated and isolated and finding it very, very difficult to reach out. And there's been reports of faith leaders actually being quite depressed and anxious about their members. Then at level 4, we saw a whole lot of false hopes, or the hopes that had been set out initially in terms of the Solidarity Fund, which seemed to be not really catering for the needs of the poorest or the informal traders. And the incredible sense of disempowerment with the food parcels and the corruption that went around with that, and that sense of a total disempowerment in that kind of situation. And I'll talk a little bit more just now about the whole concept of power under. But then the third, at level 3, many jobs have been lost. The economy, we know, is in nosedive. Informal traders lacked funds to buy stock, although now they were allowed out. And more parents and mothers have been going to work, and their children have been left alone at home. And there have been reports of adults preying on these children while their mothers have been at home. They haven't been able to call on the kinds of support systems that they've had before. There's been an emergence of a lot of increase in unintended and unwanted pregnancies, and particularly among teens, and a number of them linked to abuse. And some awful situations that some clergy have had to report. For example, one nurse who found out in level 3 that while she's been away all along, her 3 teenagers, with the oldest being a boy, he's actually impregnated the 2 younger sisters, and her crisis of how does she respond. And that's been just one example of the many, many challenges. The sense of loss of hope, and the levels of violence that we've seen, and the levels of cruelty, and sense of disempowerment, particularly also difficult for men who are supposed to be providers, who've lost jobs or haven't been able to bring in any income and have had no outlet in terms of going off to the shebeen or playing sport or whatever it might be. And the inability, as we know, it's so much more difficult for men to express their feelings of anxiety and fear and loneliness and all those things for fear of being weak. And a lot of those emotions we've seen that can easily be channeled as rage and anger. And this concept of power under, which was coined by Stephen Weinman, talking about that sense of being disempowered and traumatized, and the traumatic reaction then being an explosion of rage and violence on those around one, those nearest one. There was an article in terms of the pregnancy in Opera News saying that there was a projection of about 1 million plus girls that will be returning to school pregnant during the next few weeks and months. And of course, the continued restrictions on funerals and the increasing numbers of deaths and the inability, or not inability, but not having the spaces to grieve, the solidarity among women that is so important for women's healing, that is really not able to be lived out in traditional ways anymore. So there's a lot of emotional, mental, physical damage, as well as the economic damage. And I think that's why I'm saying the issue is around human beings who are in a desperate state. And the challenges for churches to also rethink issues like termination of pregnancy, like the stigmatization of survivors of violence, and the teachings around submission and obedience and so on. All those things are raised for us as churches in terms of being able to respond in terms of a human ministry that is actually able to bring life into this space where we're in right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. Just one question that I'm going to raise before we go over to Selena. Daniela, President Ramaphosa, even before COVID-19 was on the horizon for us, had already declared gender-based violence a national crisis. So what do you think this combination of the two pandemics, has it brought more public attention and response to gender-based violence? You know, more realization of what a big issue it is in our society? Or do you think COVID-19 has detracted attention and response? Just your thoughts.
Okay, very quickly, maybe a little bit of both. I think initially there was a real emphasis on COVID-19. I think increasingly after level 3, when we've had those brutal murders and so on, and the president himself reiterating again that these are twin epidemics. I have seen, and maybe this is one of the positives that we could say, because we have to look for signs of light and signs of God at work, has been that there is for example, the United Nations, UN Women and Sonke and others have come together with a lot of faith in the process now to work through various aspects of responding to gender-based violence, and the energy is increasing and the sense of need to be able to respond. So I think that is a positive, and I do think that President has really, by reiterating that, has really helped But on the other hand, the issue continues to be that those people that are working on the ground, responding to these harrowing situations, are still not funded, and a lot of funding has been directed into COVID-19 funding and so on. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I'm going to move us over to Selena Palm. So Daniela has been speaking a lot about COVID-19 and what it has meant for women and for gender-based violence in South Africa. Now, Selena is going to take a step in a slightly different direction and look at our religious communities even pre-COVID-19. What has been the way we respond to gender-based violence, the ways we address it, the ways we contribute. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Deborah, if you could put my presentation up, that would be great. I'm just going to wait for my presentation to come up. Great. Okay, so as Lisa said, Daniela's given us a flavour of that sobering reality of gender-based violence here in South Africa and some of the specific ways in which COVID-19 has escalated many aspects of this pandemic. So as Lisa said, I'm going to focus on a slightly more long-term aspect, the unique role of faith leaders and faith communities in transforming harmful social norms. I've called this presentation Moving from Homes of Bondage to Households of Freedom. If you're interested, Lisa will add a link in the chat to a book chapter we've written on this theme. And one challenge we've seen in the work we do, particularly at the unit, is that the home is often seen as a private space where the man is positioned as the head of the household. This often normalises patriarchal power and violence, which gets framed as discipline and headship and not as violence. Next slide, please. Next slide. Deborah? Thank you. So, we know that the dangers many women and girls face in their own homes and by people they know form the vast majority of gender-based violence cases and not the myths of stranger danger. As Daniela has already shown us, this is escalated by South Africa's lockdown and the isolation of being unable to access services. She's also spoken of those other gendered pressures emerging under COVID, the social norms and the expectations around gendered labours, the many roles which women play there. And these underlying norms can create a pressure cooker within homes and families. As Daniela said, it's important that we remember that whilst COVID and gender-based violence interrelate, COVID does not cause gender-based violence. Gender-based violence, as we know, is not a new thing here in South Africa. It affects all classes and races, and it has a long history tied to a complicated socio-spatial history here in South Africa, where many married couples were forcibly separated and even confined to different places for parts of the year. When we look together at what we can do in this COVID-19 time in relation to preventing and responding to gender-based violence, we also have to bear in mind the systemic nature of what drives gender-based violence, especially the normalisation of intimate partner or family violence. I've heard many people under COVID-19 say, when can things get back to normal? But we need to remember that normal in South Africa is often very bad for many women. Despite the many challenges and threats of COVID, it may also open up possibilities of doing things differently. Who would have imagined that our current lifestyle changes 6 months ago? This is a critical insight for gender-based violence work. We may have opportunities at this time of crisis to progress towards a new normal around the violence between men and women. So I want to suggest today 2 areas where faith leaders may have unique roles to play. One is speaking about and tackling harmful social norms and beliefs that still often lie beneath the normalisation of gender-based violence, particularly in homes and families. And 2 is imagining and working to build a South Africa where our households and families can be places of freedom for women and girls and not spaces of fear or the threat of violence. Next slide, please. I think. Next slide, please. Okay, okay. Sorry. So at the start of the post-apartheid dispensation, sorry, and I think this came up on an earlier slide, the theologian Albert Nolan called for a reconstruction and development programme for the family, which I want to suggest this remains an unrealised vision today. He said, families can be the very places where racism, sexism, patriarchy, selfishness and greed are being passed on from one generation to the next. And he said the church needs to start a movement to renew family life as a place where the rights of women and the rights of children are deeply respected. And that was back in 1995. So in our work at the URDR, Lisa LaRue and I work with hundreds of grassroots faith leaders and communities around the world, but particularly within the African continent, to surface and engage with the root causes of gender-based violence. We work across many, many countries with the Mothers Union, with churches in the Great Lakes, in Liberia with interfaith leaders, but also here in South Africa with local faith communities. And a core evidence-based premise of our work is that gender-based violence is preventable. It's not just how things are. However, whilst it's rare for us to find someone who just says, yeah, GBV is a good thing, we realise that it persists in practice, and our job is therefore to better understand why this is the case. We need to go deeper to explore what social norms drive gender-based violence, and then offer ways for faith leaders to play effective roles in challenging this. We've worked over years with faith communities to develop tools to help them to engage critically more with these harmful norms and beliefs around gender-based violence. And in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to introduce just one tool to you, and you'll see on the screen there with my picture of this issue. If we ask ourselves what lies beneath gender-based violence, we can see that there's many roots that often go deeper but yet fuel gender-based violence. So I want to introduce you to this social norms tree that we've used with faith leaders around the world, and the 3 levels. You'll see at the top level, practices, things we do. Here is where we see diverse but interconnected forms of violence. We can think of hitting, yelling, raping. But beneath those actual things that we see, those actual violent practices, we see the trunk of social norms. Social norms are about what we think others are doing, what we think others should be doing. It can include proverbs or sayings, or just practices within our culture that normalise patterns of violence. And then at the bottom, the roots, we see our beliefs and values. So this can include traditions, rituals, but just assumptions. And also it often includes sacred texts. So we can think of the New Testament household rules, or we could think of marriage ceremonies and what's said there, or pre and post marriage counselling by faith leaders. These can fuel violence supporting attitudes, but they can also challenge those attitudes. Next slide. So I'm giving you in the next slide, which is hopefully coming up, just a couple of examples. This is a complicated idea, but I did want to introduce it to you. So I'm hoping that the next slide is coming up, Deborah. And we're going to talk through how these levels interrelate. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that we've seen in the work that we do. Here we go. So you'll see at the top, remember people, violence isn't just hitting. Violence takes on multiple forms. Yes, hitting, but also sexual violence, economic violence, verbal violence, and emotional violence. So we can see some examples of that at the top, but down at the bottom, which I'm going to talk a little bit more, and also at the trunk of the tree, we can see roots which actually reinforce the conditions which enable that violence to take place. So one small example, I suppose, is that we could see if at the bottom, at a root cause, we believe that the Bible says, or that God says, that men are the breadwinners and they must provide financially. This can lead to a social norm that says that money is men's business. And at the top, it can actually lead to a pattern of economic violence that says husbands control all the money on their own and wives don't get to have a say. Or the idea of we become one flesh in the marriage ritual can be misinterpreted to endorse a social norm of the idea that wives should always be open and available for sex with their husbands. And this can lead to the practice of marital rape or forced sex. I could go on all day with the different examples of how these interactions relate, but it's one of the key things we've seen in our work, and it requires us as faith leaders, therefore, to go deep and to tackle those roots. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you one or two examples here just from our work of the trunk of those sorts of social norms. And I'm hoping that slide's going to be coming up soon. And then I'm going to give you one or two examples of the roots, just to give you a bit of a feel. And I hope that this can be a tool that can help you think analytically and critically. Deborah, next slide, please.
Selena, this is Lisa, is it the one with the Proverbs that you want? Is it that slide?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it is on. I think it's just slow on your side.
Oh, shame. Sorry, guys. The wonders of technology. Okay. So you'll see you've had a bit of time to hopefully read some of these. I'm just going to put it up on my side so that I can see what I'm talking about. But these were proverbs in the work that we've done, different proverbs and sayings that came across multiple countries. If I'm not beaten, I am not loved. A wife, this was from South Africa, a wife is like a 24/7 garage. She must always be open for her husband. And we see in many different kinds of ways. A marriage is like a bus. There can only be one driver. This was actually said by the minister at a Zimbabwean wedding that I was at. And also experiences of survivors of sexual violence. The first thing that the police asked me was, what was I wearing? And we see this filter into organisations within church structures. So we've done a lot of work with the Mothers' Union in various places. And we find this also reinforced not only by women, but by men, but also by women. So the idea that a good wife respects her husband, has a peaceful home, and does what she is told. So these different ways in which social norms, which are normalised and taken for granted, can actually fuel patterns of violence. Next slide, please. So it may be coming up before it comes up for me. So you'll start to see, and please start to read on slide 7, some examples of different core roots around beliefs and values. So I call these the 3 S's. There are more than 3 S's, but in good pastoral form, I'm going to give you the 3 S's. 3 examples of roots that we found coming up over and over again in our work in Christian traditions. The idea of submission. That wives must submit to their husbands, and that husbands may have power over their wives, and that when conflict happens, the role of a wife is to forgive or to stay and try and build peace in her home. And often this is founded on a core principle of male superiority. I can't tell you how many times faith leaders around the world have said to me, no, but Adam came first, and first is best. And picking up on that sort of creational mandate, the second one around sex, we see how ideas of one flesh get misused to reinforce a cycle of shame and sin connected to sex and sexuality. This can play out in how women's bodies are seen. Women are expected to dress in a certain way. You'll see there the guidelines for modesty. And we see how this plays out in the context of sexual violence and oppression, the stories of women where they are blamed for the abuse that they encounter at the hands of men. I see this a lot in my work with young people in the church, where they speak about body shame.
I think someone is not on mute at the moment. Sorry to interrupt, Selena. Can everyone please check if they are on mute?
Right. Next slide, please. So one key example that came up for us, and I think that we're getting to that slide in a moment, that we saw in the work that we were doing was the Mothers' Union scarf. And this was a picture taken by someone who was exploring the ideas of what lies beneath, and that the Mothers' Union scarf, whilst its original meaning was confidentiality, has grown to reflect a sign of silence, that women must be silent about things that happen in their home, even when it's abuse. So the idea of keeping secrets, and these were grassroots women within the Mothers' Union who took this picture and said, this is about keeping secrets. I must not speak about what happens in my house, and I must keep these secrets. Even if I have problems in my house, I can't tell anyone. Now, that's clearly not the original intention of this symbol, but that is now what it is meaning at grassroots level. Next slide. And just remembering that we see this story in our sacred texts. Many of you will be familiar with the Tamar campaign, a contextual Bible study that actually raises these issues of sexuality, of submission, of silence, and the ways in which this collaborates to create this story of this woman in our scriptures. And the idea is that really as faith leaders, we have to talk about these things, and we have to talk about these difficult texts and these difficult ideas, because if we don't talk about them, we can't transform them. So at the heart of all of this At the heart of all of this, we see power. That theme of Adam coming first, and we interviewed many people across South Africa who highlighted this notion of mindset and pointed to the need for genuine mutual respect and the idea that it's not that one is in power over the other. We must relearn how to talk to one another. Next slide, please.
The next slide is on Selena.
The next slide. There's clearly a delay. I'm sorry. The wonders of technology. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this slide because I'm running out of time. But I just want you to look at these pictures. We use them in a lot of communities and just reflect on the link between violence and power. So a faith leader yesterday said to me, yes, but the man can have power over the woman. It doesn't mean he hits her. And what we see over and over again is the interlink between power and social norms and violence. We might think, no, violence is only the picture on the left or the right. I can't quite work out which way you're seeing this, probably on the right. But actually, we see that whenever the man holds the power suitcase or holds a bigger power suitcase than the man, as you see from the quotes below this, there's an issue and there's the threat of violence which is there. And that this is a challenge that faith leaders have a unique role in challenging. Next slide, please. Miranda Pillay actually speaks about the danger of holy hierarchies, and you're going to be hearing more from her on other things in a moment. But the idea that we need to shift from those holy hierarchies to patterns of mutual respect. So I want to end on a positive note, and I am ending. What we've seen in our work around the world is even though these issues are really, really challenging, there's an incredibly positive and important role which faith leaders can play in transforming these mindsets and in tackling these roots, not only rushing to be an emergency response at the top of the tree. This quote from a participant on one of our projects talked about the role of the pulpit, the moral oxygen that can be given to ideas of submission and the way in which that gets misinterpreted within homes. And the idea that I think is important of the public role of faith. If you get up on the pulpit, you are in a public space and you are influencing a mindset. And that has huge positive opportunities as well. But we need to engage with these difficult issues. Next slide, please. We use 4 pictures when we're engaging with this issue of power. And this is the 4th one, power with. And what we see here is the embracing of a vision of gender equality as a faith imperative. And I want to end with that reminder. Churches have enormous spiritual capital, unique roles to play in reinterpreting how beliefs and values have often and are still misinterpreted to justify power over and violence against women. No one else can do this. In our sermons, prayers, home visits, marriage counselling and theological colleges, we have unique access to disrupt this vicious cycle of gender-based violence in our families and homes. So I want to caution us, obviously under COVID, there's almost a sense of panic. We must do something, we must do something now, but we mustn't rush so fast to be part of the solution that we don't take seriously our transformational role in unlearning these patterns that can make religion part of the problem. If we can help GBV wither away at its roots, this is as important as our responses to the practices at the top of the tree. So for now, I'm going to hand you over to Miranda because she's going to give us some more practical tips. But I want to give you a sort of intrigue. It offers us a framework to go deeper and to think what lies beneath. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selena. I'm not going to ask individual questions now. Like Selena said, we're handing over to Miranda right now. Miranda's going to make things a bit more practical. So I think Selena was already kind of hinting in that direction at the end, like what does this mean in practice for us in our communities? And Miranda's going to talk us through that a bit. And I just a reminder again, people post your questions in the chat box. I'll pick up on them and direct it to the presenters at the Q&A at the end. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Lisa, and hello to everyone. Deborah, you can get my first slide, not the introductory slide, but the other one going. And thank you to Daniela and also Selena for really sketching the background, doing the theoretical basis. And after that, I'm wondering whether there's anything left for me to say or to do still, but let's try. while Deborah is getting the slide up there. I've called this, there's not a particular theme to this one, but if I should, it would have to speak into reactive and proactive responses by the church to gender-based violence or any other social justice issues, which I will get to towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to switch off my my video now, my camera, so you only have that to look at. So in times of crises, we as the church often reflect critically on what we are called to do in our broken world. And here we are today asking again what the church can do about gender-based violence and femicide, I'd add. At the same time, COVID-19, this global health crisis with its many social ramifications, as pointed out by Daniela earlier on, also challenge us to explore new ways of being church. And over the past 3 months, we've had to do things differently, break down the way we usually do things, rethink, break with tradition, and move as the Spirit leads. Some of us have even been moved to have, especially as Anglicans who have to have communion every Sunday, have now started having drive-through communion in our car park. And I'm sure you also have many stories of how the church had to rethink what it is doing. And hopefully we can move to ask the question, how ought we to be the church at a time like this and beyond? The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has also illuminated the ongoing struggle against gender-based violence, said to be exacerbated by the national lockdown and the effects it has on households, and particularly the lives of women who are trapped in abusive relationships. Of course, as we already know, and has been pointed out by both Selena and Daniela, we also know that gender-based violence is not a new societal challenge. It is a persistent, pervasive, multi-dimensional problems with many layers of complexities. So while there are many forms of gender-based violence, I think the focus here is mainly on violence against women, because the fact is women are more often than not victims of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, some of whom do not live to call themselves survivors of gender-based violence. Next slide, please, Deborah. So I've been asked to keep this presentation more practical than academic, and I'll try to do my best. But to get out to the question what the church can do to address gender-based violence during and after COVID-19, I will just briefly contextualize why the church has a unique contribution to make to gender-based violence intervention strategies. This has already been touched on by Selena. So I will highlight two. Firstly, the perpetration of gender-based violence happens mostly to those who live in the same household as the perpetrator. And if not, perpetrators and victims are members of other households. Of course, the church seldom hears about gender-based violence amongst the households it serves, because it's always seen as something out there. Or the church really deals effectively with gender-based violence in its own household. But now with lockdown, households served by the church have themselves become sites of worship and possibly places of hope and healing, instead of the hell it is for many women who suffer abuse of different kinds. And Selena pointed out all those different kinds of abuse, including spiritual abuse, that make a woman feel guilty about challenging power and challenging her position in the household or the church for that matter. Secondly, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought gender-based violence again onto the agenda of government and civil society, including the church. And the lockdown has exposed the social drivers of the shadow pandemic, the systemic sexism and oppression that serve to keep women in her place, at home, in the church, and the workplace. And the church has in the past managed to call out and expose social injustices, such as apartheid. So the church has the capacity to influence change and shape transformation. But sometimes the church seems rather intent on keeping its tradition of patriarchal hierarchy intact when it comes to gender justice. And in many churches, gender-based violence is something that happens out there, something to which the church has to respond from a distance, not in their household. Of course, I'm generalizing now. Next slide, please, Deborah. So while COVID-19 has illuminated some of the social, economic, political, and cultural issues pointed out by Selena that exacerbate gender-based violence, women have themselves been lamenting and screaming and pleading and praying for the church to act, because gender-based violence is not something out there. It happens to church people and it happens in church spaces. We need something more than symbolic marches and lip service. I hear these women say to the Archbishop of Cape Town in 2017, when after a march, the Mothers Union had met him at the cathedral. They say we need something more than symbolic marches and occasional, often patronizing church services and programs during Women's Month. I also hear these women say to the bishop, to the Archbishop, our men who sit in our church benches, in our pews, men who serve the church also abuse us. We have come to unburden. Are we listening? Secondly, I hear the women say the sin of the church today is its reluctance to acknowledge its blind spots and inherent gender biases. So perhaps by acknowledging its complicity and the perpetuation of some of the root causes pointed out by Selena of gender-based violence, the church might be moved to see its 2020 response to gender-based violence as a kairos moment for real transformation of practices and theologies. Next slide, please, Deborah. What churches can do to address gender-based violence is informed and shaped by how the church responds, the basis from which it responds to gender-based violence. And I'm presenting here the place from which the church can respond and shape its unique response to gender-based violence and other social justice issues. I will just do a quick walk through it. The church envisions hope. It has a vision. Its vision is inspired by not the kingdom of heaven, by the kingdom, not power over, but relationality, community, and solidarity. And it's not just a hope that is wishful thinking, as Denise Ackerman would say, but it is embodied hope. incarnational, because heaven came down, for God so loved the world. And the third one is we have to conform to the ways of the one whom we profess to follow, the one who says, follow me, and transform what has become our normal understanding of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. And we also have to confront, we have to challenge. We have to challenge policies, and we have to put policies in place that need to give guidance and prevent abuse of power and privilege and violation of women's bodies and women's dignity. We have to confront systemic racism and sexism in church and broader society, as pointed out by Selena, the systemic issues inherent in our gender biases and patriarchal and headship, male headship, family stereotypes. And we have to confront the fact that we sometimes, through our way we pastor and preach, contribute and sustain the oppression of women in church and in our households. Next slide, please, Deborah. So now I'm coming to what I've really been asked to do. What can the church do? But let's just look at what the church does usually. And because I know we are all responding, sometimes it's from a place of silence, but that is also a response. But usually the response is outrage when disasters strike. And their slogans, not in my name, justice for Jesse. And sometimes we pray, we make pledges, we march, and some march literally in the shoes of women. Then there's a relief that we give. We give community support, pastoral support, as pointed out by Daniela, with family, because these are real people who need comfort and counseling. And sometimes we refer to professionals in terms of the relief, and we refer to safe places like shelters. Now, a fellow advocate for gender justice, Zana Macaulay, recently said in this forum that Daniela referred to earlier on, why is it that abusive partners, the perpetrators of gender-based violence, are not sent to shelters so that women can stay with abuse? But sometimes, as been pointed out in workshops that I've done for Hope Africa and Safi, that we are community, we don't tell on each other. And in our culture, we sort it out amongst ourselves, so we are not going to report it. And so what happens is we go into a culture of silence, and as the media silences and reports die down and there's no hype about reporting gender-based violence, we kind of go into a mode of recovery until the next spike in gender-based violence and femicide. Next slide, please, Deborah. So these are reactive responses, which are important. We have to react immediately. But there has to be ongoing awareness raising and education and advocacy. The type of work that Selena is talking about and Daniela is talking about, and the type of work I know that is happening in many, many, many churches. I'm sure that many churches are already doing some good work in their responses to gender-based violence. The question is, to what extent are we also addressing the causes of gender-based violence, which have deep roots within our church traditions, theologies, it espouses, and the practices it holds on to. Now, this has already been pointed out by Selena. So it brings me to the fact that we can't continue to respond by reacting to gender-based violence when it receives media attention and sending out pastoral letters and having men stand in church and make pledges once off and so on. We also have to be proactive in what we do as a church if we're asking the question, what can the church do to address gender-based violence? And so lastly, I'm just going to list a few things that I think could be done. So as I mentioned earlier on, some of the proactive responses is to put policy and guidelines on gender-based violence in place at parish level even, and to deal effectively with sexual harassment that happens in the church. This will open up the space to talk about sex and sexuality and the taboos around it and the demonization of women's sexuality, the control of women's sexuality, and so on. And to give clear guidelines what to do when one finds oneself in an abusive situation. It happens, and we need to speak about it. It will open up the subject. It will open up safe spaces in the church for both victims and perpetrators, because very often we only work on the right-hand side of this disaster management continuum that you see on your screen. We only respond when it happens. So we have to open up, and usually, as I say, when it happens out there, so we have to open up safe spaces where people can speak out and speak up and come and ask for help. Not only when someone dies. Secondly, we have to put in place and support a gender ministry with concrete aims and goals and outcomes. Not only once-off gender workshops, often seen as something outside of church business. Thirdly, perhaps we should think about mainstreaming gender justice and gender-based violence intervention strategies in all aspects of church life, whether it's marriage preparation, baptism, our youth work, and so on. It should be mainstreamed if we are serious about it. Fourthly, encourage liberative, transformative Bible study approaches for women and men, as pointed out by Selena. Number 5, I say be intentional about using gender-inclusive language. And I can't stress this often enough, that how we speak, the power that we use, usually in the way the narratives, the discourses we use, sustains and justifies hierarchies of power. So we have to be intentional about using gender-inclusive language. Number 6, we should pause, look, and listen, and hear the screams and see the suffering. We have to rethink the way things have always been understood, interpreted, and done. What we defend as tradition, because that is what Jesus did. The 8th point, remember that representation doesn't equal transformation. We can't say that we have women ministries and we have women in places of leadership, but our ecclesial spaces and places and relationships haven't been transformed. Number 9, intercede through prayer. Be moved to act from love, in whose image we, men and women, are created. And I'm leaving, usually there's 10 things that we'd like to point out. I'm going to leave the 10th one for you to think about, because this is not an exhaustive list. And on that note, I will conclude. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Miranda. Thank you so much. I cannot speak for everyone who was listening now, but I feel fired up by your concrete suggestions and by how you are challenging all of us through all these various things that you explained and named. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring us together into a general question and answer session now. So all three our speakers will respond. Some of the questions might be directed to one of them, but the other two can feel free to also add. So I'm going to start with a question from Jeremy, and I'm just going to read it. Hi, Selena, thanks for your presentation. I agree about the abuse of sacred texts for legitimizing the normal, such as women's submissiveness to men, particularly in intimate relationships. Glib attempts to rescue the Bible to protect its sacredness seem to me to carry a good deal of responsibility in this regard. Have you found evidence of a different hermeneutics for engaging the Bible in the communities in which you work? My worry is that women so often buy into the biblically justified abusive patterns, and I battle with that. So, Selena, if you can respond, but then Miranda or Daniela, please feel free to also add on.
Okay, so just to say yes, absolutely. That idea of rescuing the text really comes up. We've seen over and over again, I think Lisa is nodding, the importance of sacred text engagement, of really getting into the text and engaging with its ambiguities. We've been working with the mothers' unions in Zambia in particular, and we ran really interesting contextual Bible studies with them in the morning. And part of what we needed to do was surface some of the contextualities, but also the ambiguities within the text. So we picked deliberately provocative stories. We picked the story of Jephthah's daughter and said, what would you do if you were her mother? What would you do? How would you behave? We picked phrases like slaves obey your masters. And then we said, you know, how do you feel about that? And then how does that put women obey your husbands into a different light? And we found that doing these studies with women was really important because there was a lot of internalization of patriarchy by women and belief in these texts. So actually, rather than avoiding talking about them, we're only talking about positive texts. We found the opposite, and I think Rob Segman's also made the same comment that you actually have to help them to read differently hermeneutically. So, and in a short phrase, I would say we ask them to embrace the hermeneutic of life. To say, what does it mean that we start with this dilemma and how do we respond to that? And how do we respond with a hermeneutic that's liberating and that's life-giving? And then within the light of that, they're then able to start critiquing some of the aspects of the text, particularly when it's a text that has been used in harmful ways in the past. And I have to say the slaves obey your masters text is often one of the first texts that I start with, because then they actually have to start to engage with how that's being misused, and you're able to then apply that to different kinds of intersections. So yeah, I'm going to stop there because I know we have limited time, but I know Miranda's got a lot of expertise on this area as well. Desmond Tutu speaks about top dogs and underdogs and how we must move away from those sort of dominating models to embrace, I think, sort of circles of dignity where we stand next to one another. And that's definitely one of the activities we do in our work at the unit. Mm.
Miranda, do you want to add on to that, please?
Yes, I can just say that we cannot ignore texts of terror. We have to unpack and acknowledge, and we have to preach about it. We have to, definitely speaking about hermeneutical tools, we have to be able to see how women's voices have been silenced in the text and not go to a quick giving voice and agency, but to really grapple with the intricacies of it. And there's many resources out there. Only problem, of course, and I call it a problem, is when I am invited to preach, I choose one of these texts of terror, and then I'm not invited back. Thank you, Lisa.
Sorry, you didn't hear me laughing, but I was laughing and kind of laughing in empathy because I think many of us have had that experience before. I want to move on to a next question.
Lisa?
And it's kind of, yes, please, Daniela,
sorry. I just wanted to add that, I mean, I definitely recognize the value of using those texts of terror, but also a lot of people identify very closely with the person and ministry of Jesus, and using a different kind of lens to re-look at the life of Jesus and how he spoke and how he related to different people. And I always say, for me, Jesus was the first feminist. There are some Bible studies that we developed some years ago, for example, on Jesus as a role model, also for men, as a man, and how he related. So some of those not necessarily very complex but challenging ways of actually just looking more personally at the person of Jesus can also be helpful. Thank you.
I agree. If I may just, Lisa, I agree. And of course, as Anglicans, we are very blessed to read Old Testament, New Testament, Psalms, and the Gospel on a Sunday. So we have all those, the kind of breadth of and the movement to an incarnational theology and a theology of love. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to ask a quick question that Evelyn posted, and this is, I think, also kind of around this practical thing, but do any of you know of youth programs in churches that have mainstream gender justice? So in the way that, Miranda, you spoke about, I think many of us feel, practical help. Like, is there a manual for doing this? So any examples that you can give that you know of? I'm kind of putting you on the spot right now. Anyone? Selena, Daniela, Miranda, go for it.
If I may I go ahead?
Please do, Miranda, and then Selena, it seems like you want to say something. You're just slow because of your bad connection. So Miranda, you go first.
So I'm not aware of any manual per se, but I'm aware of the work that Safi does with kind of having a text and having both the youth and the Sunday school and the women's groups and the men's group work with the same text, and see what comes out of it. Yeah. So that might be one model that I know of. But perhaps, Selena, you know of something else?
Like off the top of my head, I think it's something Lisa and I will talk about and maybe circulate some resources around. I think from my own experience in my local congregation at Rondebosch United, this has been something we've journeyed with, and we've used the model of what's called circles of dignity as our sort of overarching vision. And this has enabled us to grapple with various intersections, to not silo gender off, but to kind of really create a platform for inclusion and dignity of all types of people. And I really like Miranda's comments, because this has been about how we actually update our songs, and use words like kingdom rather than kingdom, and getting feedback from our young people, particularly our young women, our youth, around how they're imagining God, building things into the Sunday school that actually reimagine God differently and reshape some of the rituals. Our language in our churches is so embedded in patriarchy that you actually have to be quite creative, and involving women in doing that, having women on your worship committees or running the worship committees, but to give them a transformational mandate. Like you say, representation isn't transformation. But I think we sort of think, we have to change everything all at once. I think in our church, it was about starting to change small things, to say before we say the Lord's Prayer, to our God, who is both mother and father, we pray. And like little small things that started to drip feed a different imaginary about God, and then to embed that at all levels within the Bible studies and within the communities. And I do think there are specific resources out there, contextual Bible studies and different rituals. But I also think it's not about a new manual that will fix it for you. It's about embedding what we already know, but we forget to do because we're kind of busy just getting on with our everyday lives as faith leaders. And to have a core metaphor at the heart of your church that places inclusion and belonging for everybody at the center, and that requires a critique of what we have inherited, and not to feel that we are throwing our traditions out. I think, as Miranda said, Jesus questioned his traditions, and therefore to see reform and radical reform as part of what we're called to do, as part of our faith ministry, and not to be afraid of it.
Thanks, Selena. Miranda and Daniela, is there something you want to add to that?
No, I just think that Selena's suggestion of a core metaphor is so very, very true and helpful. We've been using church without walls and swimming upstream, and in our local congregations, and it kind of reminds us, of to be mindful of not only the way we do things, but the way we say things.
Lisa, if I can just come in, not necessarily to list particular materials, but I've been struck by, I can't remember which of the two others have mentioned the whole idea of creating safe spaces. I think it was Selena, and the importance of that. But I remember a priest actually saying in one of our forums once, when people were talking about that, Vernon Hammond, that others may know, and he said, how can we create safe spaces when in fact we need to become safe spaces ourselves as those who are representing the church? And as we minister to youth or children or whoever, what does that mean? And what does that mean also to become a safe space for survivors, that they would feel safe to speak, or people that are just frightened and don't know how to handle the situation? And I think that is a really important fundamental, regardless of what material one uses and so on, is to really think through that really carefully, what that might mean in practice.
Thank you, Daniela. Now suddenly everyone's posting questions and I struggle to keep up. I want to post a question here from Holele Simon. Thank you, Selena. But Daniela and Miranda, you must listen to this as well. In many of our African contexts, these unions, and I think I was talking about Mothers Union, because Selena, you were referring to that, these unions have untapped vitalities or powers and resources for changing GBV, but the structures in some groups make it impossible. Do you and other colleagues doing research in these areas have data on responses of groups in this and other denominations? So, it's kind of that tension between this potential for good, but then how the structure or the system can be holding back and actually making these unions complicit. So can you respond, Selena, but Miranda and Daniela as well?
Sure. I just want to give an example, actually. You'll notice I use that example of the Mothers Union headscarf, and that actually comes from an empirical project we're doing in Zambia with the Mothers Union at the invitation of the Anglican Church, which is amazing, really, because we were able to get buy-in from senior levels, and we're working at grassroots with women who are Mothers Union members to use a very creative methodology. It's called Photo Voice, and I don't turn to explore it all now, but it's an amazing methodology that really enables women at grassroots to actually start speaking out and sharing in a safe way what they're seeing. So they document stories and photographs of what they're seeing within their communities and churches. And what happens through that is they become co-researchers on the programme. But that information then filters all the way back up to leaders. Lisa and I are able to go and share with the leaders and with the Mothers Union leaders, the structures and systems. What happens is that then some of the patriarchal issues within these systems and structures are highlighted, but at the same time, Simon, the point you're making about the vitality is also released. These women were incredibly proud of the Mothers Union and the roles that they played, but they also said things need to change for the Mothers Union to remain alive. And one of the nice things they did was they quoted the original Mothers Union objectives, and one of those objectives is healthy relationships. And they said, some of the things that are happening are not creating healthy relationships. They're actually silencing women and perpetuating abuse. But we know as Mothers Union that we want healthy relationships. And actually what that looks like in the 21st century is very different to what it might have looked like in 1850 when the original Mother's Handbook was done. And I think it created momentum and energy for realizing that changing those structures and moving with the time was deeply in line with the core vision of the Mothers' Union, and not to sort of write off those systems and structures because they often do still endorse patriarchy, but to enable those conversations to be deepened and to have those conversations with women at all levels of the hierarchy, not only at the top level, because the Mothers' Union is a very top-down structure. But actually, when those women start to hear voices of women from below, they're actually able to see the consequences of some of those systems and structures and to change those. And my sense would be that, yes, data, but actually what we found was you needed a qualitative storytelling methodology, because it's those kinds of stories that can become transformational, and that we may have all the information in the world, all the statistics in the world about GBV, but it's actually the stories within our community that can change us the most. And I think that's been a really powerful momentum to build a different kind of Mothers' Union, which has been amazing. Yeah, so I wanted to give that example. And we do, Simon, we have a lot more information on some of that. You know, it's always nerve-wracking for the Anglican Church to invite researchers like us in, to come in and to kind of trust us enough to say, come and help us and work with us. And I think that sort of basis of trust is really essential, that they trust that we won't just throw the Bible out of the window or refuse to listen to things that they hold dear, but that we will work with them to transform them.
Daniela or Miranda, adding something in 30 seconds, because I'm watching the clock a bit now.
Maybe just to say very quickly, this is a wider activist thing, but there is a voice app called Ubumbano Voice App. And some of the Pepisa survivor group members are very active on that. It's a WhatsApp space where community structures encourage anybody to just tell their stories, either in writing or on voice notes, and they go on a website and they are drawn off there. And perhaps wider community voice spaces like that can also be useful, given that that everybody is part of some, or almost everybody in most communities are part of some faith community themselves, and some of the stories that do come through. Thanks.
Miranda, do you want to add, or can I continue?
No. Thanks, Lisa.
Lisa, you're on mute.
And I thought I would get through the 90 minutes without doing that, but clearly not. I just want to acknowledge that on the meeting chat, I'm seeing quite a few questions and comments being posted about men's roles. So what we often see within our churches is that it's women being, you know, active and activists around gender-based violence or gender or safe spaces. But how do we get men involved? How do we get men to take responsibility? Because this is a joint issue. Unfortunately, we don't have time now for me to post those questions to our presenters. I just want to acknowledge that these questions are there, and please feel free to reach out to our presenters. You can also email me and we can take the conversation further. But I want to use our last 5 minutes to ask each of the presenters, and let's go in the order that you spoke, Daniela, Selena, and then Miranda, in 45 seconds. And this time I'm really watching the clock. Just maybe your final thoughts after the questions and the things that we spoke about now as well. So Daniela, if you can go first, please.
Thank you. I just want to perhaps surface the issue of the churches having, or faith leaders, the unique access to families, and what that might mean. I also just, it strikes me that there are 2 more S's to your 3 S's, which are, Selena, service and sacrifice, and some of the consequences of those underlying beliefs and the practices that they result in, particularly if women are not complying. I just, as an activist, I don't want to miss this opportunity to put out a call to start a movement. We have, as we will speak out, a number of other church and faith leaders from different faiths have put together a statement of commitment, which we call a new Kairos, a call to transform so that we can develop proactive responses. And I'm inviting you to have a look at the website on the chat, and to have a look at it and see if you would like to sign on to that, and then to be part of thinking through ways of what these things might mean in practice. Thank you.
Okay, shall I go straight, Lisa? So maybe as a theologian, to quote the Bible, to respond, I think it's in Micah, the idea that without a vision, the people perish. And I just want to remind you of that slide, the fourth picture of the man and woman standing holding the power suitcase, and that vision of equality, gender equality in Genesis. And I think sometimes when we deal with these difficult subjects, it can feel too hard and people don't want to do it. And I think as well as tackling these difficult subjects, we need to offer a vision of gender equality that is grounded in faith, that is grounded in our mandate as faith leaders. And it can enable us to see this not as this secular thing that now people are pushing on us that we must now do, but to see it as at the core of our vision of what it actually means to be the church. And I think this then enables us to have a vision, but also ensure that to get to that vision, we don't just hover in the abstract realm of peace and love and justice, but we start with the stories of the women who are most marginalized. We start from below, we start from the position of the crucified Christ, so to speak, and we say, who are those voices, those women who are struggling, those women who are locked in their homes, those women who are beaten up? How can we come alongside them and have a vision for a world that can be different? COVID's shown us that our world can change much more quickly than we thought it could, but yet in the pandemic of gender-based violence, we haven't changed it in ways that we could, but we can. And that possibility, I think, in the end, we have to be motivated by positive possibility. We have to be able to be champions of hope for a new reality. And I just love that image of the man and woman standing together, because it's not just about violence, it's about power, and that power doesn't have to be bad. Power can be where we stand together and we're stronger. And if we can imagine marriage and family like that, that vision of the RDP of the family, I think, can turn from vision into reality.
Miranda.
I like the note on which Selena is ending now, because it means that we have to respond from a place of who we are, our identity, instead of what we can do. We must first ask who we are. And that one slide that I didn't have much time to speak on, the one on the 4 discourses, which I've been influenced by James Gustafson, 4 discourses for change: prophetic, ethical, narrative, the stories of people. There's so much power in the stories, in the lived reality. So my prayer is that we will have a vision, because we're a people of hope, but we will embody that vision so that it doesn't remain a pipe dream, pie in the sky talk, and when the next disaster strikes, it's there all the time. It's just when we get this media hypes, of course, and then we gather in this way again. Let us respond from the place of the one who created us, through love and for love in this world. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to draw us to a close because we're on the half an hour now. So if you have time, everyone just hold on 2 more minutes. I want to thank our 3 presenters for what they shared with us today, for their insight and their passion and their reflection, and for how they've challenged us. I think Miranda who said, you know, the time has come to be proactive, not reactive. And I really think that is true. And what has also struck me is how much of today's conversation wasn't because of COVID. This has always been the situation. COVID has maybe just given us the drive or brought attention to it, but this has always been an issue. So I want to encourage all of you who joined to not stop now, to really think about what you heard, to challenge yourself and your communities around this. Read more. You know, the URDR website is a good place to start. You can email me if you want to reach out to some of these presenters or to some of the resources that they spoke about. And the recording will also be available there. I want to remind you that the third in our series, in this Healthy Household series, will be in about a month's time. The date is yet to be confirmed, and that will be around religious communities, child protection in the time of COVID-19. But yes, I think the final words to leave you is this a Kairos moment for our religious communities and gender-based violence, and let's make it one. You know, let's take up that challenge. So thank you everyone for joining. I hope you have a wonderful week and a safe week, and that we speak again in a month's time. Thank you.